in 1953. And yeah, I was around. I was in diapers, but I was around. You can see the new Chevrolet for 1953, and I love that Elizabeth was crowned Queen of England that year. It was the very first issue of Playboy, and little did Marilyn know she'd have a rose named for her later. People were afraid of Russia. What else is new? And the AARS winners for that year, that's the All-America Rose Selection winners, which in its time, that was a big deal. And one was Ma Perkins, which we do have in our collection at the Huntington, but you don't find it in Commerce, and Chrysler Imperial, which still is in Commerce. And Chrysler Imperial was the very first rose to be named for a product and got sponsored. In fact, the owners of Armstrong Nursery got a brand new Chrysler Imperial for the project. And the breeder at Armstrong Nurseries was Herb Swim. And if you don't know Herb, you'll recognize it when I start talking about some of his roses. And he had 2 stints at Armstrong. He was there for about a dozen years, and then he fell out with them, and he moved on. So this was toward the end of his first stint with Armstrong. And Herb was a forward thinker in many ways. I consider him a great American rose breeder. And he was thinking about shrub roses. And shrub roses were a brand new concept at that time. Nobody had even heard of a shrub rose. And I don't know why he landed on the species rose, Rosa Suliana, but he did. Maybe it was the cinnamon fragrance of it. Maybe it was the large pyramid-shaped clusters. I'm pretty certain that's one thing that really attracted him. Maybe it was the foliage. The foliage has an unusual pigment of dark red around the edges. And maybe it was the disease resistance, which is another important factor for a good shrub rose. It certainly wasn't its petalage, and it certainly wasn't its blooming habit. He was not a single petal guy at all. Not at all. And once blooming, of course, didn't give much traction on the marketplace. But beyond that thought, he didn't get much of a chance to really do anything. He brought the parents in, but in 1955, he departed from Armstrong and formed a partnership with O.L. Weeks of Weeks Roses. Now, Mr. Weeks had seen how profitable it was to have your own hybridizing, so he and Herb created their hybridizing program from scratch that year. And the very first year, they made this variety, Mr. Lincoln. Yeah. So that's one of Herb's greats, as well as Angel Face and many others. And that partnership lasted until 1967. Now, Mr. Weeks was cantankerous, I think is a nice way of saying it, or curmudgeon, perhaps. So he and Herb parted really bitterly and never spoke again after that partnership. But O.L. continued with the breeding program forward on his own. Now, during the time that Herb was out for his partnership with Weeks, the Armstrongs had brought in David Armstrong, the 3rd generation, who had a PhD in genetics. He was the most highly educated breeder in the United States at that point. And he had been running it for that time, but he had decided to leave Armstrong, so Herb returned to Armstrong in 1968. And that very first year that he was there, he bred this variety. Yeah. Those 2 varieties are amongst the top 5 roses people request when they come to our garden at the Huntington. And rightfully so. Now, roughly after that time, he hired this guy. This is Jack Christensen. And Jack was his assistant in the breeding because Herb was having some health issues, mostly cardiac. And he knew he would have a limited time, but he was still hybridizing on. So we're going to jump to 1970. There's the new Chevrolet. I love this headline, Moonship Leaks Gas. Playboy had improved their photography a bit. We were still afraid of things. And the ARS winner that year was a solo one, first prize, which is still in commerce. But that was the year Herb finally was able to fulfill his wish to start breeding shrub roses, and he crossed Rosa Suliana with Europeana, the dark red floribunda with beautiful foliage. And it was a successful cross. So this is the first generation, Rosa Suliana times Europeana. And I don't have a picture, but I can tell you it was a pink blend single, so you know it was a cross. It still had the large clusters. It still had the clean, dark foliage. It was still once blooming, unfortunately, which doesn't surprise me. And it was still a huge plant. But that was the start. Then in actually 1973, Herb's health issues forced him out to retire. And Jack took over the breeding then in 1974. And he took that seedling from Herb and crossed it with Zarina. Zarina, the orange-red floribunda, a very famous rose. And this time he got a pink blend semi-double, so a few more petals. Still had the great clusters, still had the beautiful foliage. But it also had a little bit of rebloom, and it was somewhat more contained, but it was still big. It was still big, so now we're in generation 2. Then in 74, Jack crossed that seedling with several varieties, both as male and female. And it generally proved to be very prolific, setting a lot of seed and giving a lot of babies. And in that year, he hired this guy as his assistant at Armstrong Nurseries. So this is my symbol that I'm going to do something very unusual for you. I'm going to give you a narration because I cannot illustrate the next part of this story. So 2 years later, when survivors of the 1979 crosses came to flower in the field, it was a sight to behold. Their great-great-grandmother's huge clusters of lower petal flowers had come through in almost all of the babies. The unusually pigmented foliage held strong as well, showing a deep red picotee on the young green leaves. Most of them had climber-like habits, but a few were more bushy to compact in style. I had never seen anything like that group. Of course, I was a young breeder and easily influenced. Jack liked them as a whole, but he was strictly trained to discard the more single-petal varieties. I thought there was certainly an introduction. Well, there wasn't. In the fall of 1982, there was a great group called the San Gabriel Valley Rose and Horticultural Society, and they were sponsoring a talk by Claire Martin, the new curator of the Huntington. And Claire was going to give a talk on shrubs, this relatively new idea, unveiling some of the then also new David Austin hybrids. I was so excited by the bloom of these Suliana babies that I decided to cut a bouquet of different colors for show and tell at the meeting. It was a colorful mass of huge hydrangea-like heads. To me, it exemplified what the concept of a shrub rose should be: gobs of flowers, lovely clean foliage, and a more relaxed habit for the garden. They had a member whose name was Julia Sudol, and she was a pistol. She was a phenomenal Polish Catholic spitball of a plant person and a very active member of the group. She made these amazing potpourris for her church as a fundraiser, where she would dry whole buds, small buds, and spiral them around the outside of the container and then fill it with potpourri. The crowd had begun to dissipate after the talk, and I was carefully hovering over them because I didn't want them to find new homes. That's when Julia sidled up next to me, because she was kind of short, but she always stood on your toes when she talked to you. Okay, Julia stood right there and got right up into my face to convince me that she had to have a cutting of the one yellow seedling because the yellow was the rarest color out of the bunch. I realized that no was not going to be an answer. So I relented on the promise that she would never disperse it to anyone else. Within the next 4 years, Armstrong Nurseries dissolved and was swallowed up by the corporate world. Sadly, I had to end my relationship with Jack and watch many seedlings with fantastic potential get lost in the shuffle. It still breaks my heart to think of that time. After an 11-month vacation, I was fortunate enough to begin my career as hybridizer for Weeks Roses. The company had recently been purchased from the Weeks family by a partnership of old Armstrong Nursery staff. During 1987 and the first year of Weeks, I acted as the California sales rep because we were in the process of relocating from Mr. Weeks' property. I had some time to gather thoughts on parents for that first year of hybridizing. It was then I ran into Julia again at a Rose Society meeting. She always gave me great hugs, and then she pulled me down to her level and whispered, "That damn yellow thing is eating me out of house and home." It took me a minute to realize what damn yellow thing she was talking about. And then when I realized what it was, I almost jumped for joy because I thought that was long lost, because all the others had been lost. So that's where we are now in time. So let's see what this seedling has brought forward. As we brought it into breeding, we immediately propagated and shared it with Jack Christensen as well. And this is the full genetic outline of that seedling. And its number is 79520B6. And rather than give you all this information every time I talk about it, we're gonna put a little green squiggle on there as a symbol for this seedling. So as a parent, it gave a few varieties, one of them being Flutterby, which looked a lot like the mother, except Flutterby has more of a blush. And Flutterby is no longer in major commerce. It is still around, but that's Playboy times squiggle. Notice the single petalage. Again, some other minor introductions that are long gone. Long Tall Sally, which was All That Jazz times 79520B6. And Bebop, which was Santa Claus, a miniature with squiggle. Now both of these had more contained habits. Flutterby was a climber. And there was one more double seedling to emerge that's still in commerce, and it is a climber, and that's Sky's the Limit. And this is with some of the Poulsen breeding crossed with this seedling. Now, as a grandparent, we began to see some changes. The climbing habit was still hanging on, as with All Ablaze, and with Spice So Nice. All Ablaze is still in commerce. There was a minor personal introduction that year too for the Roland Nursery in the Pacific Northwest, and it was a climber. And then Jacob's Ladder. Now look at that bloodline. Santa Claus is a miniature, and this is its offspring, and that's 7 feet tall. This was a minor introduction by Edmonds. I thought it was long lost. And this gentleman that you see on the right, he came to one of my lectures at the Huntington early, and we began to talk, and he told me how he would attend my lectures every year at the Huntington. And he made the comment, "You didn't like Jacob's Ladder very much." And I turned to him and said, "You have Jacob's Ladder?" "Oh, yes." Turns out he lived like 3 blocks from me in Altadena. So we went over there and collected wood, and Colin would come every year to see his baby in the collection. And then when he passed, we had big, huge sprays of it that we could cut and put to his funeral. So it came back around. From that same year as well, as a grandparent, there were 2 more contained habits that emerged. Out of the Blue was at the beginning of my search for purple, and it's still in commerce. Miami Moon, though, even though it was a tidy floribunda, it is long out of commerce because its disease resistance was very poor. Now, as a great-grandparent, we're starting to see more changes. There were still some climbers coming forward. This is Night Owl. There were more contained shrubs, but still single-petaled, like Paul Leakey Jr. And then there were a couple of winners. One of them was Wild Blue Yonder, an All-America winner. Still in commerce, still a personal favorite. I love the lilac fading into the center and the intense fragrance and the huge clusters. And my purple work goes back to this seedling. So Eptide, Midnight Blue, Route 66, they were all sister seedlings from the same cross. And here's the cross. Yeah. Now it was actually Sam McGrady who taught me to breed with as wide a bloodline as you possibly can. Don't just interbreed your own stuff. So let's look at Sweet Chariot from Ralph Moore and Visalia, fantastic rose in and of itself. Blue Nile from France, Stephen's Big Purple from New Zealand, International Herald Tribune, that's the IHT from England. And then Sweet Chariot and Blue Nile brought back into the bloodline. And this is what brought forth the nice rich purple color, and the intense clove fragrance comes from the Harkness family in International Herald Tribune. And then there's the favorite grandchild, Julia Child. Now I know many of you have heard this story, but there are some who might still be interested. Yes, Julia Child did choose the variety herself. She never saw it come to commerce, unfortunately, but we have been after her for a few years to name a rose for her, and she always said, "Oh, I'm not worthy." But a friend of hers, this is Rose Story Farm in Santa Barbara area. They had an unusual operation, they're still around, where they grow garden roses outdoors and cut them for the local rose market. So it produces very different bouquets to be sold versus the greenhouse produced flowers. So because of the unusual aspect of her business, I would send Donnie seedlings like a year prior to introduction or 2 years prior to introduction just to see how they would go. Well, she had received a plant of this under number. And Julia knew her parents through the food and restaurant industry. So they had invited Julia over for dinner, and she of course wanted to stroll through the rose garden. This was in flower, and she said, if there ever were to be a rose named for me, I would like that one. And Donnie called me the next day, and we jumped on it. Now they did not know that it was an All-America winner. At that time, we couldn't tell them. And I think had Julia not been alive, the lawyers would not have allowed it because they've never released the name for any other usage. But she did want it, and she did get it, and it's certainly the top rose of my career and the most international acceptance as well. Except in other countries, they deem the Julia Child name unsaleable. So this commonly happens. It's not something just for this rose. In England, it's called Absolutely Fabulous, and I love having the Fab Rose. In France, it's named for a licorice soda pop. In Czechoslovakia, for Czechoslovakian ascaris. In South Africa, it's named for a petroleum company, which sounds bizarre, but they have a plant at every gas station, which is good. And in Australia, it's soulmate. In Japanese, I'm not going to even attempt it at all. But it has had it's one of those very unusual varieties that perform the same everywhere it goes, everywhere. Now let's talk about the great grandkids and beyond. Cinco de Mayo. A lot of people think this came out of hot cocoa, but it doesn't. It's Julia Child. Then a larger form of Eptide Twilight Zone. So Eptide brought the Suliana bloodline in. This is Happy Go Lucky. Again, a Julia Child. You'll see that name appear a lot in parentages. This is Uptown Girl, which was recently re-released. And this is State of Grace, which is actually a sport of Uptown Girl, and I think the color is actually prettier than Uptown Girl. They're both big, robust plants that are free flowering.
What's a sport?
A sport is a mutation. So this happens occasionally in roses. As the stem grows, sometimes the chromosomes don't split evenly, and you'll end up getting a branch with a different color or a different habit. Color is the most common. So one gene didn't quite come through, and in this case it was a color gene. Now if you propagate off that stem, if there's enough to propagate, you can have a whole new variety, which is what happened here. So you don't commonly see it, but it does happen. It does happen. And then sports will want to occasionally revert back to the original form. You'll see that with iceberg, brilliant pink iceberg, and burgundy iceberg. Those are two sports of the original iceberg. And they kind of want to go back ever so often. So sometimes you'll see a purple flower with two white petals in it. Or sometimes it's like someone took a spray can and divided it right down the middle. So in the rose industry, it's called a sport. Jump for Joy and Sparkle and Shine are sister seedlings, and both of them are so abundant in their bloom cycle. In fact, Sparkle and Shine greets our visitors when they come into the rose garden at the Huntington, and Jump for Joy is around the tea room entrance, always in flower. Right now, just blooming like crazy. And there's the parentage. Further on, Grand Dame, the big, tall, super fragrant, comes from Wild Blue Yonder. Diamond Eyes, one of the darkest purple colors, it's a miniature. And you can see that very complex parentage. It should have been a climber, but nobody told it. So it's not. Then Huntington's 100th, this was named to honor our centennial at the Huntington. And it also should have been a climber, but somehow didn't get the message, but we'll take what we got. And it's also called Life of the Party. Wonderful fragrance on this rose. It just reeks of fragrance. You don't even have to put your nose in it. You can smell it just next to it. So it's really a beautiful variety with a great habit. So if you think about the habit that we started with and the petalage, this is a huge advancement. Of course, we're now 7 generations away, too. Going further, Easy to Please, a shrub. And yes, I'm officially tired of easy names. Violet's Pride, a soft lavender floribunda. And then Pretty Lady Rose, which is a more compact version of Doris Day, of Grand Dame. But actually, the squiggle is behind both those parents. Celestial Night, a dark purpley color from Christian. And again, squiggle is behind both those parents. And All Dressed Up, which is a great landscape pink. And again, on both sides. Perfume Factory is one of my newer introductions. I'm very proud of it. It's a magenta color, very strong growing plant, extremely fragrant. In fact, I think it just took the National Award for Fragrance. And Golden Opportunity is a climber, a large golden flowered climber, which was one of my long-term goals in breeding.
I love that rose.
Isn't it great? Great foliage too. And hopefully you can come see us at the Huntington one of these days. That's my hangout as my retirement job. And I've been hanging out there for almost 14 years now, guys, so holy cow. But it is not a bad office space at all. And one rose I want to tell you about that does not have any squiggle in it, and that is Easy on the Eyes. And this is a Healthemia shrub. That's, again, one of my latter introductions, and I'm very pleased with it. This is across the Sweet Chariot. Again, Ralph's little baby has been such a great parent for me. So it opens up pink with the raspberry eye, it fades to lavender with purple eye, and finishes white with a purple eye, all in the same cluster. And they're cinnamon fragrance. It's a tight habit. It gets absolutely no powdery mildew, absolutely no black spot. Clean as it can be, but it has the weirdest coloration on the canes. They look gray when it comes to pruning time, and you think, are they dead? But they're not. And this one is a real beauty to tuck into a landscape and not take up a lot of space. And in the spring especially, it looks like an azalea in flower. And we had a double rainbow in October. Any questions by chance?
Did you have a situation where you felt like you took it too far?
Did I have any situations where I thought I took it too far?
Yeah, like you had a lot of situations where both parents or children or grandchildren, did it ever turn out kind of like you're like, oh, it's still like totally good?
Well, a lot of times you would set a goal when you make a cross and hope to achieve that goal. Sometimes you do, most of the time you don't. Yeah, because the numbers are so against you on it. I can't ever say I felt like I took it too far. I think if I'd been breeding back in my own lines a lot, I might have had that feeling. But I kept crossing outward whenever I could.